Good morning. My name's Karlyn Bowman. I'm a senior fellow at AEI. On behalf of my colleagues, Michael, Norm, and Henry, I'd like to welcome all of you to the first session of the 2012 Election Watch series. I thought I'd begin this morning with my favorite poll from this week. It was from a Gallup USA Today poll released yesterday. People were asked which of two statements best describe their attitudes about the 2012 campaign. The first statement was, "I can't wait for the campaign to begin." And the other was, "I can't wait for the campaign to end." We're frequently told about a deeply divided and polarized public, but 70% of Americans, including solid majorities of every Democratic group, said they couldn't wait for the campaign to end. And of course, it hasn't officially started yet, but here we are. This is a very special occasion for Norm and me because this is the 30th anniversary of AEI's Election Watch program. In our first session in 1982, Richard Scammon, the great psephologist, moderated the session. He was a great political demographer, and in the age before exit polls, before the networks called elections, Dick Scammon was the big brain of NBC, knowing very much like Michael Barone every individual congressional district, looking at early results from those districts and calling the election campaigns one by one. Scammon had written a book with our emeritus colleague Ben Wattenberg in which they described the typical voter as a 47-year-old wife of a machinist living in suburban Dayton. She was middle-aged, middle-income, from the middle of the country, and understanding her views would be the key to future electoral success. The Dayton housewife became so famous that the producers of the Dick Cavett show sent a team of assistants out to find her, to find someone like her from Dayton, Ohio, and she eventually appeared on the show. Of course, since that time, pundits have anointed many other groups as the keys to the election. We've heard about soccer moms and NASCAR dads. But in 2012, I'd still place my bet, not $10,000, but I'd place my bet on the Dayton housewife. Also in 1982, in that first session, the Democratic strategist Ann Lewis was a guest. And with her, we were among the first election analysts to discuss the fabled gender gap. It proved to be one of the new dividing lines in our politics nationally, and even among Republicans. In Pew's new national poll released yesterday, among likely Republican voters, Newt had a 20-point lead among men, but among Republican women, nearly as many supported Romney as Newt. The gender gap is still with us. One of the things that's distinguished AEI's Election Watch series over the years is our handouts, and I think you should all have a copy of AEI's new political report. And here I'd like to thank especially Andrew Rugg, Jennifer Marsico, and Brent Scher, all of whom are here today, who've worked on putting this together and I think making it an extraordinary compilation of information. Claude Aubert, AEI's resident designer, has made it beautiful. Each month, our political report tries to give you a sense of where public opinion is. And in this issue, drawing on work done by Ron Brownstein of the National Journal, we looked first at the electoral map at the states that Democrats and Republicans have won in each of the last 5 elections. We then provide you with snapshots of the early caucus and primary states, drawing on new census data and also on 2008 entrance and exit polls. Then we compare Obama to his predecessors at the end of their 3rd year in office. As Frank Newport of Gallup noted recently, Obama's approval rating is the lowest of any president in December of the 3rd year, going back to Dwight Eisenhower. We think that Political Report is one of the most valuable compilations of poll data available in Washington, and I hope you'll take it back to your offices and share it with your colleagues. Last week, Gallup started daily tracking of the Republican nomination contest. In their latest 5-day rolling average released yesterday afternoon, Gingrich led Romney by 11 points. In the Pew poll, his lead was slightly larger. In the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll released this morning, the lead was 17 points. In addition, this week, we've had a dozen new polls in key primary and caucus states. What are all these results telling us? First, that the Republican nomination battle has been one of the most volatile in the recent history of presidential politics. Since August, in Gallup's data, Perry, Kaine, Romney, and now Gingrich have been the leader. And in the distant recesses of time earlier this year, Huckabee, Trump, and Palin either led or were tied for the lead. At one point in Gallup's polling, Gingrich's support among Republicans dropped to 4%. In Pew's polling, it dropped to 3%. 44% of Republicans in the new NBC Wall Street Journal poll this morning think Gingrich has a better chance to beat Obama, and 40% say that Romney does. Since 1980, the moderate candidate has won Republican nominations, in part because conservatives haven't been able to unite around a single candidate. That could be changing now. As for the mood, which is what I specialize here at AEI, satisfaction with the way things are going in the country is very low, as is the view that the country's on the right track. The vast majority of Americans still believe that we're in a recession. Consumers don't think their wages and jobs are coming back anytime soon. They don't see the values of their homes rebounding, or do they believe that their retirement funds are going to be restored? The levels of negativity are very similar to what we saw in 2006 and 2010, where there were political earthquakes. The degree of negativity is important, of course, but so too is the duration or the persistence of these negative attitudes. We are in uncharted polling territory. Never before in modern polling history have we seen negative attitudes last so long, and they're now seeping into our views about state government and also about the American dream. Given these dismal ratings, all documented in this issue of Political Report, it's surprising to me that Obama runs such a close race with Romney and a little less close one with Gingrich. It's also surprising that on the famous generic congressional ballot question, the Democrats lead the Republicans, as they did in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll this morning. I'm going to ask Michael, Henry, and then Norm to tell us all what it means. Each of them is going to speak for about 10 minutes. And Michael's going to speak first about the nomination contest, Henry about the general, and Norm about what it means for policy. Michael, let me start with you. You've just returned from New Hampshire, so we'll have a report from the ground. Karl Rove said last week that organization matters a lot in these early states, but I think you have a different point of view. How much does organization and money matter in Iowa and the other early primary states and caucus states? And are we in for a marathon? Perhaps more important, how will the RNC's new rules about awarding delegates affect the contest?
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Karlyn, and it's nice to be back in Washington after visiting America. New Hampshire version, and seeing the actual primary process and the voters and the candidates in action. We have interesting things on Monday night. I was at a forum in Windham, New Hampshire, at a beautiful high school where Newt Gingrich was asked if he favored the position taken by Jefferson and Madison in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798 that states could nullify laws that passed by the federal government. Inasmuch as we had some kind of a military conflict in between that date and now, suggests that that's not a top issue. Newt dodged that issue, invoking his historian's prerogative of saying that Jefferson and Madison backed away from their views. He did not criticize them, however, for changing their position. Anyway, the things you pick up along the way. My sense is that some of the old rules of the nominating contests, which have not been in force forever. We really only had the kind of primary heavy nominating contests that we've got now since 1972, just a period of 40 years. And there have been 8 previous Republican seriously contested races only. But one of the rules has been that you've got to organize and do personal campaigning in Iowa and New Hampshire. The picture is invoked of Jimmy Carter staying in the homes of Iowa voters and making the bed each morning, and tucking in the sheets properly and so forth, making a good impression that way. And of course, he's in the White House later, and it's not recorded whether he made the bed there or not. I think some of that is changing, and we could see this in Iowa, for example, in the public opinion surveys where we've watched candidates vault to the top of the Iowa polls without any discernible organization at all. I mean, Rick Perry, enters the race on the day of the Iowa straw poll in Ames, August 13th. He enters it from the non-Iowa-centric location of Charleston, South Carolina, and immediately jumps to the lead in polls not only nationally but in Iowa, as he's ostentatiously not showing up for the straw poll and not having any organization there. He nonetheless overshadows Michelle Bachmann's victory at that point. We've had the Herman Cain jumps to the lead in Iowa. Again, when I was out at his headquarters, it was basically empty. I mean, they never really moved in any furniture. There wasn't much of an organizational campaign. And similarly, we've seen the same thing happen with Newt Gingrich. Again, he's made personal appearances in Iowa to a considerable extent, but not that much. And I think one of the things that is happening there, and I think it's happening in New Hampshire as well, is that the new media has, in different ways, displaced some of the old organizational techniques that proved to be successful in the past. Rick Santorum has visited all 99 counties of Iowa. Michelle Bachmann promises that she will do so before the caucuses January 3rd. But voters seem to be getting, at least attentive voters seem to be getting, an in-depth sense of what the candidates are really like through cable news and the debates, which are being watched by more people than really ever before. In previous cycles, you'd have a debate that was held and it'd be broadcast on one station in Council Bluffs, the educational TV station in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and nobody else would ever see it. We're having 6 million people watch these debates now or more. And people get a sense out of YouTube videos. Chris Christie is not a presidential candidate, but an awful lot of voters around the country really feel they know what kind of person he is because they've watched those 6-minute and 28-second clips of him addressing a teacher union member somewhere in a town hall in New Jersey. And those have made a real impact. And the campaigns are reaching out to people in ways that are very different. In previous campaigns, you'd go and campaign, the campaigns would boast, we've got 12 headquarters in the state, and the phone banks going on, and volunteers coming in and calling people. VoIP technology has changed that. Now people make the phone calls from at home. The campaign can feed in the numbers that they're supposed to call, the message they're supposed to do, and then keep track of whether they've actually made the calls or not, and how many they've made. And there's no phone bank. This is all taking place over, wirelessly around the state in a way that the campaign can keep track of, but that isn't visible to the traveling political reporter who is in search of a phone bank and can't find one and sees nothing but empty headquarters. So I think that things are going on in a different way, and ironically, the national picture that people have in some ways is becoming more important, and the local things somewhat less important. Karlyn mentioned the business about the Republican National Committee and the rules. In previous cycles, Democrats have tended to allocate delegates by proportional representation, which they think is the only fair way to do things, and which makes a certain sense for a party that historically has been made up of disparate groups of white Southerners and Northern Catholics from big cities who will get along fine as long as they never have to encounter each other. And you give them proportionate representation to keep the balance in your party. Republicans have tended to allocate delegates by winner-take-all rules, and that makes a certain historical sense in terms of the party. The Republican Party's core group has typically been people that consider themselves and are considered by others to be in some sense regular Americans, Northern Protestants, married people, whatever, who by themselves are never a majority of the population in this always diverse country, but nonetheless that. And so, the idea is whoever comes out in first place, they go ahead. Well, the RNC changed this in an attempt to avoid front-loading of the counter. of the calendar, and it insists on proportional representation for delegates chosen in contest before April the 1st. That's really going to make it much more difficult for any candidate to cinch the nomination early. In 2008, John McCain after Super Tuesday, February 5th, had approximate lead in delegates of about 500 to 200 over Mitt Romney. If you went through the exercise of reallocating the delegates, adding 3% to the popular vote for Romney and subtracting 3% from the popular vote for McCain in each of the contests, and then trying to follow the delegate allocation rules, you would have had, by my estimate, Romney ahead by about 380 to 360. Totally different race. Why? Because McCain, winner-take-all favored McCain. In California, which voted on Super Tuesday, McCain carried 48 of the 53 congressional districts and won all the delegates from those 48 districts, even though the race was this close in a dozen or more districts, and proportional representation would have given him a very small edge in that delegation. Nobody's going to be able to do that before April 1st. And I think that means, in practice, Mitt Romney's currently trailing in trailing Newt Gingrich in the polls in 3 of the 4 January contests in the Iowa caucuses, South Carolina primary, and Florida primary. He's leading in New Hampshire, and that lead seems to be genuine. It's in there in the polls, and I think that, looking at the national polls and then the various state polls, Gingrich seems to be leading more in the South than in the other regions, reflected particularly in the South Carolina result, leading less in the North. And what's interesting here is that Republicans will have winner-take-all contests in the April elections, and those include states like Maryland, Connecticut, Delaware, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, California, New Jersey, and probably Ohio, where they haven't quite settled on a date yet. Those are all states which intuitively sound more like Romney states than like Gingrich states, if the national polling remains at current levels, and gives Romney, who also has enough money to stay in, a plausible excuse for continuing to run, saying, hey, I'm going to make up lost ground in the post-April 1st things. That's at least one dynamic that could take place. Money. It seems like every 4 years we've heard a lot of well-intentioned people decry the amount of money it takes to spend on campaigns and how terrible it is, that it's so expensive. George Will then writes a column pointing out that we spend, 3 times as much money on deodorant or something. But one of the things that's happening now is there's less money, at least on the Republican side. The Mitt Romney, who's capable of writing a check for $50 million, not just making a bet for $10,000, has chosen not to write that check this time. And has not raised as much money or spent as much money as he did last time. Newt Gingrich, 3 weeks ago at least, had something like $1 million in cash and $1.6 million in debts. His proposals to get rid of the federal deficit have nonetheless, or whatever, have taken him to the lead in the polls. So it's not money that's driving it. When I entered politics as a political consultant in the 70s, the general rule was money matters. Money is absolutely essential, because the only way to communicate with voters is television advertising on the ABC, NBC, or CBS outlets. It takes money to buy that. You need to have time to raise it by direct mail or by personal, by big fat cat contributions or whatever. You could take the metric of who started off with the most money and then make a prediction about who was going to be a viable candidate and could win the election. I think that rule, not necessarily so, at least in the Republican primaries. Now, the ads may be more important as time goes on, but also you can get a hit from ads that you just put out on the internet, and you never actually pay WHO-TV any money. So I just want to see those people who decry big money take a look at the fact Republicans are spending less while Obama and the Democrats are spending more.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. Now we're going to turn to Henry with some thoughts about the general election. Henry, as I mentioned earlier, the mood is absolutely dismal, but all of the polls show some impressive Obama strengths. His favorables remain high, and in the CBS poll released this week, despite a 33% approval rating on handling the economy, nearly 6 in 10 said that he had worked hard to bring about change. A plurality in the new Fox poll said that his agenda would help the country and the economy in the long run and should be supported. 57% in the new CBS poll said that he was a strong leader. Could you sketch out a Romney and Obama contest and then a Gingrich-Obama race? In recent articles, you've been focusing on the white working class, and I'd like to know what groups you're watching most closely at this early stage and how you think they may play out in the election campaign this spring and fall. Thank you.
I think the general election is going to be characterized by both sides talking about the choice that we're going to face. Both sides see this as an incredibly consequential election. Both sides see the other side as being unacceptable choice, both as on a basis of what it means to be an American and on the basis of what it means for our economy. And you get a sense of this from a quote. You get a sense from that every day by listening to Republicans, but you get a sense of that from a quote that I saw in this morning's morning score from David Axelrod. He said, talking about something he heard from an alderman in Chicago when one of his colleagues won for higher office, just remember, the higher a monkey climbs on a pole, the more you can see his butt. Speaker Gingrich is very high on the pole right now, and we'll see how people like the view. The president, regardless of the nominee, is going to, the president is going to do a lot of pointing out the Republican nominee's shortcomings. And in part, he's going to need to do that because based on the polls, he's got virtually no chance of getting 50% of the people to vote for him solely because they want to see him reelected. Even the most optimistic polls show that his approval rating is mired in the mid-40s. Most polls show it in the low 40s. If you break it down, that's almost entirely fueled by support among African Americans who, depending on the polls, still support him at 85 to 90%. Among whites, his support is in the low 30s, and among whites without a college degree, who typically have been the group that decides American elections, he's below 30, and among white men without a college degree, he's hovering in the mid-20s, which is roughly where Richard Nixon was on the day of his resignation. It's very difficult to take a look at this and see anywhere, if you're David Axelrod, any way to get to 50% on your own. Democrats got 44% in last year's House races, somewhere between 44 and 45%. That's probably about President Obama's floor. Maybe he can get up, improve perceptions of himself so he can positively get in the mid to high 40s, but he's not going to get to 50% without some help. And that means that he's going to need to either demonize or divide his opposition. And that's where the matchups with Romney and with Gingrich come in. Right now, the polls all show that Romney would be a stronger nominee. That's been what the White House believes, which is one reason they've been trying to soften Romney up by talking about things like the $10,000 bet to show that he's allegedly out of touch with the average person. That's ultimately going to be Romney's weak point. The groups that I think are likeliest to be targeted are two types of voters, and I'm not going to talk about them demographically, but by their voting patterns, although there are demographic correlations with these. The first and more important group is the sort of person who voted for Gore in 2000, Bush in 2004, Obama in 2008, and the House Republican candidate in their district in 2010. This voter is dispersed throughout the country, but tends to be more highly concentrated in the suburbs in the north and the west. This voter tends to be more educated. This voter tends to be white, of particular, many different ethnicities and backgrounds, but a little more Catholic than the nation as a whole. Romney profiles very well for this voter. They also tend to like calmer, more temperaments, and they also tend to like candidates who are at least not aggressive on social issues, not necessarily socially liberal, but not aggressively traditional or rhetorically forceful about their pro-life or pro anti-gay marriage views. Romney profiles very well with this voter. That's where his strength was, the suburban voter in the 2008 Republican primaries. He profiles well among independents, particularly among college-educated independents, and that's the major reason he runs either slightly ahead or slightly behind President Obama in all of the polls that we've seen so far. Romney's problem is going to be with the white working class. Romney has a very, then that gets the second group of voter, and that's group of voter is kind of breaks into two categories: sort of voter who votes Republican for president, but traditionally has voted Democratic for Congress, or the even smaller group, but increasingly crucial, given the demographic changes in this country, the voter who voted for Gore and Kerry, voted for Obama, or didn't vote in 2008, but voted for House Republicans in 2010. They were the people who fueled about 6 to 10 of the House Republican victories, and they're very crucial in particularly upper Midwest states. Romney will have a hard time with these voters because of his background. They tend to prefer economically populist. They are depressed about their future. They feel out of step with the American mainstream. They feel that the elites of both parties don't have their backs in the economic difficulties that we're facing. And it's that sort of voter that when Speaker Gingrich talks about Bain Capital, as he did yesterday, he was immediately scathingly attacked by the conservative commentariat, but that's the sort of attack that will resonate with this sort of voter. And you can see early on some indications of that, which is that Romney, in a recent Wall Street Journal poll, President Obama ran behind a unnamed Republican by 12 points among white working class voters, but he ran tied with Romney. Gingrich has the opposite problem, and that's showing up in the polls too, which is that Gingrich tendency to shoot from the hip, his intelligence but undisciplinedness tends to hurt him with voters, tends to hurt him with women, as Karlyn pointed out, and all of the polls show that, two that were released today, show him running about 9 to 11 points behind Obama's, and with President Obama over a majority. For Speaker Gingrich to win the election, he may do better among the second group that I spoke about, but he really needs to work on his temperamental displays, and he really needs to work in order to win the suburban voter, the Gore, Bush, Obama Republican voter, who's absolutely key to the election. Dividing the electorate. Increasingly, it looks like there might very well be a third-party candidate. Third-party candidate would have no chance of winning, but consider this, that in the most Republican year since 1946, in an electorate that was significantly skewed towards Republican, or mildly, not significantly, but was skewed towards Republican-leaning electorates, the Republican House candidates only received 52.5% of the vote in 2010. They don't have much room for error. And if you think you can get 47 or 48% of the vote on your own, it only takes a third-party candidate to get 4 or 5% in order to squeak through to a victory. In fact, most Democratic candidates, when President Obama received nearly 53% of the vote in 2008, if you throw out the election of LBJ because of the nomination of Barry Goldwater, and you throw out the Great Depression years, that was the most a Democrat had received since 1832. Most Democrats win with under 50% of the vote, or just barely over, as Jimmy Carter did. Donald Trump keeps flirting with an independent run. Many people think that that's not serious, but if he were to get into the race, he would have a great appeal to that working class voter. He's been trying to cultivate that image for a while. His attacks on birtherism were the sort of attacks, or the birther controversy, are sort of attacks that would resonate with that group. Wouldn't win, but if he got 3 or 4% of the vote, that could be fatal. A Ron Paul candidacy might attract diehard Tea Party candidates, 2% of the vote, 3% of the vote. Again, in a narrow election like this, that could have a major impact. And Americans Elect is a group of moderates trying to get access on all 50 state ballots. If they were to find an attractive candidate, you could have somebody there profiling with the suburban voters. So generally, I think that the weaknesses of the Republican candidates among the key demographic groups is one reason why Obama continues to run well despite his weaknesses. It's still an uphill climb for the president, but any presidential race is a choice between two people. And as George Herbert Walker Bush proved in 1988, you can have upside-down poll ratings and still win an election if you convince the electorate that the other guy is worse.
Americans clearly like choices, and I think that's been historically the reason for support for a third-party candidate. But there was an interesting question in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll this morning. Only 34% said that the two-party system is seriously broken and the country needs a third party. Only 12% thought the two-party system worked very well, and 51% said that it had some real problems, but with some improvements it could still work very well. But that appeal of choice, I think, is a very strong one overall. Norm, now we're going to turn to you to talk about policy and what it all means. I think Norm has perhaps watched Newt more closely than many people in this city for a very long time. In 1978, I think AEI launched a series of off-the-record briefings here at AEI. Norm and Tom Mann Brookings selected a group of members of Congress that they thought would be leaders in the future. Among that group, Dick Cheney was part of that group, Geraldine Ferraro, Marty Szabo, and Newt Gingrich. And this group got together, a bipartisan group that doesn't happen very often anymore, and talked about problems in Congress and the way that they were approaching issues. But that was, I think, your first exposure to Newt in a very significant way. I mean, you clearly know what Congress's ratings are, 11% in the CBS News New York Times poll this week. 76% in the Gallup poll said that most members of Congress do not deserve re-election. And in the National Journal Congressional Connection poll that was released yesterday, Independents, the group, of course, that swung massively in 2006 and 2010, said that they had little faith in either party and they were not inclined to re-elect their own member. This sort of very deep pessimism that I've been talking about, I think, may mean that a lot of bets are off in terms of Congress. Norm, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Karlyn. John McCain says that Congress is down to blood relatives and paid staff, and I'm not sure about the blood relatives or the paid staff. Michael started by saying that he had been in America in New Hampshire, which I think is probably why Mitt Romney, trying to get in touch with America, bought a vacation home with 12,000 square feet, a tennis court, a swimming pool, and a sport court in New Hampshire, so he could get close to the real America. I've been up in New Jersey, where yesterday it was 61 and foggy, just like Rick Perry. But in defense of Rick Perry, it's good to have a candidate who's only groping for words. Speaking of Herman Cain, he has suspended his campaign, but he's asked to keep his Secret Service protection, at least until his wife cools off. And Karlyn did mention Gingrich. I did want to say one of the things that Michael didn't talk about much was endorsements, which have mattered a great deal in the past. And some good news for Newt, some important endorsements he scored this morning. Harry Winston, Van Cleef, and Arpels, and all the Tiffany family, and his ethnic coalition is led by Jimmy Chu, Manolo Blahnik, and Badgley Mischke. I want to make a few comments, first of all, flowing on what both Michael and Henry have said. Within the Republican Party, if you look at the nomination struggle going back many decades, there is a strain, which is the establishment versus insurgents. You could go back to Robert Taft and Wendell Willkie and Tom Dewey. This is taking on such an interesting coloration now, and we're going to see this play out over the next few weeks. And I was struck this morning that in the Washington Post on the op-ed page, virtually every op-ed was about Newt. and he was attacked from every angle. But George Will and Kathleen Parker, who represent the Republican establishment journalism wing, at least, were particularly tough on Newt. Newt has become the candidate of the insurgents, and Mitt Romney is the candidate of the establishment, but I don't recall a candidate of the establishment who had weaker support among the establishment than Mitt Romney, which is why Romney has been unable to crack 25% support within his own party, despite doing so well in all of the debates and raising the money and having the support of people who tend in the Republican Party to close ranks behind the heir apparent, which is almost always somebody who ran before, didn't quite make it, and comes forward the next time. And Newt is an odd candidate for the insurgent wing of the party in so many ways, having spent so much of his career in Washington. But it's a different time now, and it's a time in which in some ways we have a different underlying tension, which is who's co-opted whom within this party. The establishment believed that they had co-opted the Tea Party movement and rode to these great victories in 2010. You could certainly make a case that it's the Tea Party movement which has co-opted the Republican establishment when you look at the questions asked and the answers given in most of the debates moving forward. And the more you get attacks on Newt from visible figures in the establishment, given that strain of populism, which has hit the right as much as it has the left, he may well have the tactical ability to deflect those attacks and make them work a little bit more to his advantage. But at the same time, those attacks, partly because of the shoot-from-the-hip, undisciplined approach that Newt has always taken, saying often just wild things and then thinking that, they'll be forgotten when he decides to drop them or move in a different direction. When you move to be a front runner, get a much greater pressure and a much more analysis. And you could see this a little bit in another op-ed in the Washington Post today by Ruth Marcus, who, as a younger reporter, had covered Newt's ethics problems that resulted in an admonishment and a $300,000 fine that Newt has now redefined as being just a minor technicality. But when you start to go into the specifics, it's something different. And that's going to happen in a whole host of other issues. And as we move forward and move into January, February, March, you could see both of these candidates showing more weaknesses than strengths. And I do not discount the possibility of somebody else entering the race in February or March. Not somebody who can win a nomination outright in that fashion, but as Rhodes Cook, a very good analyst, has pointed out, there are enough delegates that will not have been selected by the time you can come in February and still meet filing deadlines, that you could almost guarantee a race that would go to a convention. Then you get to another interesting dynamic, which is this is not going to be a convention like the ones we are used to from the past or that we saw in the movie The Best Man, where you have a brokered convention because there are no brokers anymore. You don't have governors who control state delegations. You don't have unit rules. It's not clear who those delegates will be or who they'll listen to. And so we could get what all of us who followed politics for years have dreamed about and haven't seen. The Republicans didn't have a convention that went to a second ballot since 1948. We could have a wild and woolly convention. And I would underscore all of this with another point that Michael made as well. Newt has risen because of these debates, but it's not even that the debates are getting more attention per se. It's that social media now plays such a different role. People watch debates and then they start to write about them. They email their friends. They send links to stories. They send links to the YouTube video. We see any gaffe or a particularly sharp moment that shows up there, and it expands the base of people who are watching. And all of that is something that's beyond the control of what we would normally see. Now, with all of that, let me just step back for a couple of minutes and talk about the dynamics of the policy process. now and how that plays into the presidential race, and there's an interactive effect there as well. We are leading up now with basically 3 weeks to go before we hit those Iowa caucuses and then get on that roller coaster moving forward. But we have in that 3 weeks some real tension inside Congress as we're getting the usual endgame negotiations and showdowns amplified to a different level. A part of this, of course, is over the payroll tax cut and how to pay for it. That also plays into the populism. And the fact that we've seen Republican leaders go from skepticism, if not outright hostility, to an extension of the payroll tax cut. We don't like temporary cuts. This is going to add to the deficits. Now has turned into, well, of course we want a payroll tax cut. It now becomes a question of how we pay for it. And trying to deflect attention away from what Obama has driven as, do you want to protect the rich or do you want to give a break to the middle class and the working class? That was resonating enough that you've seen this very substantial change in approach, in strategy. But now, of course, John Boehner was able to push through a payroll tax cut that includes a lot of elements that are unpalatable to Democrats and the president. And not only do you have the president saying he wouldn't accept it and he will veto it, but we now have this played out on a second part of the chessboard with Democrats not wanting the House Republicans, having passed their bill, to leave town for the recess and say take it or leave it. But by holding up an extension of the continuing resolution for the rest of the year. Another change in strategy, by the way, on the part of Republicans who before pushed for showdowns, potential shutdowns of parts of the government so that they could block the EPA from implementing its regulations, block the Affordable Care Act from moving forward, block Dodd-Frank. Now it's we don't want those battles. We want to basically pass a continuing resolution for the entire year, radically different from what we saw with 2011. But now Democrats saying we're not going to pass that through until we resolve the payroll tax issue. All of that could play out in unpredictable ways, in ways where, generally speaking, a president has the upper hand because the president has the bully pulpit. That goes back to Ronald Reagan and confrontations with Democrats in Congress that he always won whenever you had these showdowns. And will have some impact, perhaps, on populists out there as they approach Iowa. Now, as we move into next year, we're going to get another series of interesting dynamics and confrontations as well. The failure of the supercommittee means that we have, first, the consequences that flow, which means sequesters starting in 2013, with dramatic cuts in defense spending from where it would otherwise be, and discretionary domestic spending, and basically flesh wounds to Medicare. Now, you might say, well, that's not going to happen for another year, so we don't even have to worry about it. But the budget that the Defense Department is going to have to put forward for a fiscal year that begins October 1, that ends the following September 30th, which means 3/4 of that year is going to be shaped by a sequester. It means another $50 billion in cuts from what they had already expected, which includes $50 billion in cuts already that the Obama administration had put forward. And other agencies, means that this will be right on the table starting early in January. And you're going to see a very concerted Republican effort to try and obviate those cuts that isn't going to go anywhere because it's leverage to try and get a larger budget deal. Then we have the realization that before Barack Obama's term ends, whether he wins or loses, all the Bush tax cuts expire. And he has already said he will not allow the tax cuts for those making over $250,000 to continue. Now, Republicans in Congress, and with some pressure from their candidates for the presidential nomination, are going to start to think about whether they want to move towards a point where you get $800 billion in tax increases on the rich in return for nothing, or whether you want to cut a deal where maybe you're going to get $800 billion in tax increases, but in return you can get tax reform and some of the changes in Medicare and Social Security that you want. So we have some cards to play in the policy process in the coming months that undoubtedly are going to be played out in a presidential campaign as well. And what it probably means is we see these candidates struggling to gain support. Romney trying to peel off some of the support from insurgents, taking a tougher conservative stand, and basically is going to be saying, make no compromises, take no prisoners. Gingrich, no doubt, with the same kind of appeal, and others that will be a kind of magnetic force pulling the congressional leaders away from any desire they might have towards a bargain. And President Obama channeling both his inner Harry Truman and his inner Teddy Roosevelt, perhaps having less of an inclination to cut a deal that would dilute support from his own base. So fasten your seatbelts not just for what's going to be a bumpy presidential nominating ride, but what's going to be an unpredictable policy process.
Thank you very much, Norm, Michael, Henry, for very concise and insightful presentations. And now we'd like to turn to your questions. And if you could identify yourselves, we'll start over here with Gerard Alexander. If you could wait for the mic.
Gerard Alexander, the University of Virginia. The speakers have mentioned Obama, of course, but his strengths and weaknesses have not really been a central focus of this commentary. And I'm wondering if that's because, in your judgment, we already know what those are, and it's exploring the strengths and weaknesses of his rivals that merits some time right now. Because I, for one, 4 years into watching him every day, still can't decide how strong or weak I think he is. So, for example, his maneuvering in combat with his congressional rivals, John Boehner and Paul Ryan and others over the last year and a half, does that suggest to us that his political instincts are very good and his tactical and strategic senses are good, that he knows how effectively to combat Republicans, or does it suggest otherwise?
Who wants to take a first shot?
Well, Norm said that the president has been absolutely obdurate in saying that the 2001, 2003 tax cuts on high earners will expire. That's what President Obama also said in 2010, and then he caved and made a deal in December, a year ago this month, on that. It seems to me working for President Obama is a general feeling among Americans. They want their presidents to succeed. They want them to do well. They want to think well of them. I think this factor helped Bill Clinton in 1996, helped George W. Bush in 2004. I think it works for President Obama. I think there is a reluctance on the part of many voters to be seen to be rejecting the first black American president. I think that's understandable in light of our history, and that's a factor which tends to work on balance for President Obama, as a similar factor worked for him in 2008. On the other hand, he gets highly negative job ratings on the economic issues and so forth, and clearly is coming in with a macroeconomic situation which is far from ideal. That's subject to some change, but it seems like that's not there. I would argue that he has been, how was he perceived as a negotiator? What interests me, President Obama, before he became president, spent about half his time in public office running for higher public office. It seems like as president, with no higher office to run for, he spent about half his time running for re-election, and that's before the calendar year 2012. And I think that's in spurning the Simpson-Bowles Commission and other invitations to address long-term problems. I think he's shown himself to be more interested in campaigning than governing.
I'd take a slightly different tack on this. In his first 2 years, Obama focused on legislative success and had quite remarkable legislative success. He had to do it as if it were a parliamentary system, and we don't have a parliamentary culture, and so he hasn't gotten the credit for legislative success that might otherwise have come. In the process of doing so, he basically abandoned the bully pulpit and the ability or the willingness to shape a narrative. And I think a part of that was that, having run by saying, I'm going to move to a post-partisan era, he believed it and went through 2 years, almost 2.5 years, before saying, boy, that's not going to work, and moving to something else. Now he's moved forward with an aggressive use of that bully pulpit. And by picking up first on the Harry Truman do nothing Congress, do nothing Republican Congress, and now in an era which I think is a very different one than what we've seen before. I saw Ramesh Ponnuru was saying, the inequality issue isn't going to work by using poll data from 2008. Poll data from 2008 in this case doesn't matter. We have a much larger populist sentiment out there, and it's a populist sentiment now where in the past Democrats would have collectively shrunk from the notion of even supporting taxes on millionaires because you'd be for a tax increase, where now that doesn't hurt, and where the sense of sharp inequality that I think does go back to, it was triggered in 2008 by TARP, moves forward, and he can gain some additional traction. At the same time, it's possible that he will have some negotiating success here by raising the temperature and raising the stakes for policy failure. So that may work for him. But he's got a problem, and that problem is the one that Michael mentioned. Even though you see Americans still blame the Bush administration for the economic problems more than they blame him because he's been president for 3 years and it's on his watch and it's going to be his responsibility. So he does have to turn this contest into something that not just George Herbert Walker Bush did with Michael Dukakis, but George W. Bush did with John Kerry. And that is to make the opponent seem so unpalatable that it's just too big a risk, a bridge too far to move in that direction. So I think we're going to see a very tough campaign. And I think he's fully capable of running that tough campaign. And it may well be that he won't have to be as tough because a lot of that work is going to be done by his opponents going through this extended and acrimonious process. If you even just look at the exchange of the last couple of days, where he doesn't have to attack Mitt Romney for Bain Capital, Newt Gingrich is attacking Mitt Romney for going after Bain Capital. And he doesn't have to attack Newt Gingrich for his failures and excesses and crony capitalism and $1.6 to $1.8 million of influence peddling from Freddie Mac. Mitt Romney is doing that for him, and there'll be a lot of others. In fact, Jim Talent and the surrogates are doing even more. So you can't discount the possibility that those political abilities will emerge in this second half of his term as well.
Thanks, Norm. Presidential elections are performance-based judgments, but it is striking to me how strong the personal qualities are holding up with the American people. There's a different view in Washington, but again, those personal numbers are very, very high. The favorables are still very high, higher than certainly Newt Gingrich's. So that's interesting. We have another question here. While you're getting ready to ask your question and wait for the mic, I should say in the new NBC Wall Street Journal poll, do you consider yourself a supporter of the Tea Party movement? 27%. That's been remarkably consistent in their poll since September of 2010. Do you consider yourself a supporter of Occupy Wall Street? 25%.
The conventional wisdom is that no incumbent can survive when a re-election bid when there's high levels of unemployment. But I've heard a contrarian argument which says that they can, so long as it's declined by at least a significant amount heading into the election. That is, as long as people perceive that things are on the mend, the incumbent can still survive if there's been a decline, even if the numbers overall are still high. I was wondering if that's a view that you all share.
I think there's two things we need to think about here. One is the difference between employment and unemployment, and the second is the timing. In past years, when we've had a decline in unemployment, that's been followed by an increase in employment. What's happening right now is that the decline in unemployment is primarily being fueled by people dropping out of the labor force. So the traditional way of measuring the job conditions are not holding true for this particular recovery. The second is the timing question. Typically, when economies have recovered, they've tended to recover much faster, so it's much more perceptible than the current one is, and it's happened earlier in the third year. George Herbert Walker Bush in 1992 had a recovering economy, but it was happening too late to be perceived as being a significant recovery by most of the voters. And I think we're getting very close to the point where, unless the economy were to change trajectory dramatically and would start producing serious employment gains, not unemployment drops, that whatever rise is going to happen won't be large enough and won't be consistent enough to really impact and help the president.
Let me just say, if you were to ask Barack Obama what 2 words would characterize his chances of re-election, they wouldn't be Romney or Gingrich. They would be Angela and Merkel. Because, in effect, the real danger to him, I think the greatest danger to him, is that Europe fails to resolve in a serious way its problems. We see a collapse in the Eurozone, and if that happens, it's going to drag us down to a point where that trajectory will not be moving in the right direction for him, but moving in the wrong direction. And unemployment could reach double digits before the end of next year. And then, even if there are 4 or 5 candidates out there and Americans elect candidate, don't discount Ron Paul as a real factor in this race, by the way, who could win Iowa and then be spurned by his party and run. And there may be somebody else. And you may have a really weak Republican candidate, but if you're a president facing unemployment that has now gone to 10 or 11%, you're in much, much deeper trouble.
Henry took us back to George Herbert Walker Bush, but if you look back to Reagan and the very deep and painful recession, by this point in Reagan's presidency, nearly every indicator was turning up and moving in a positive direction, and his sunny optimism, I think, also helped him with a still difficult unemployment situation.
Well, optimism and 7% growth in some of those quarters, which is about 6% more than we've had in any of the Obama quarters.
We've seen recently redistricting in Texas in the news media. Can you comment on what's been happening around the rest of the country and its implications for the House?
There's still a lot of states out. Pennsylvania released its maps last night, which are creative, ugly, and pro-Republican. Right now, because of various judicial victories and the operation of various commissions, redistricting is probably a wash. It might be slightly leaning in favor of the Democrats, but a large number of that depends on what happens in Texas. But right now, redistricting has succeeded in shoring up most of the freshmen who were elected in 2010 in historically blue but currently red-controlled states. So while Republicans aren't picking up from the redistricting, they're not in any danger of losing the House or having significant inroads into their majority because of redistricting.
I would just say that tend to agree with that, and you know, the Republicans were controlling more legislatures, but you've had a basically Democratic-leaning plan by the supposedly independent commission in California and a very aggressive Democratic plan in Illinois, which might be subject to challenge on the grounds that it failed to create a Hispanic district that it could have done. Combined with Republican over-aggressiveness in Texas, where I think they very ill-advisedly behaved like pigs on redistricting, got slapped down by a federal court that imposed its own plan, which is basically a Democratic plan, Martin Frost coming back to life, political life. He's still very much with us personally. And then going, and now the Supreme Court has said that that plan should not go into effect, at least preliminarily. So we'll see what happens on Texas. Texas has produced a lot of redistricting angst over the last several decades, and really outstanding political gerrymanders, both by Democrats in the 80s and 90s and by Republicans more recently. So on balance, kind of a wash. Republicans in states where they had control of the cycle last time and have control of the cycle this time, like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida with an asterisk, Georgia, have basically served to protect the people they have now, with the largest Republican House contingent since 1946-48. And Republicans will make gains in North Carolina, where the governor does not have, a Democratic governor does not have a veto over redistricting bills.
A couple of comments. After Angela and Merkel, the next two words might be John and Roberts. The Supreme Court is going to has shown a striking and astonishing, in many ways, willingness to jump into the political arena at a very, very volatile time, something that historically has not been the case. So we're not only going to get, in the heat of the campaign, a ruling on the constitutionality of the individual mandate and the Affordable Care Act, but a Texas redistricting case that could make a difference of 4 seats in the House of Representatives. And almost certainly those decisions will be 5-4. We aren't quite sure which way, but it's going to make it fairly explosive. The only other point that I would make, I think both of my colleagues have been right. Republicans are not going to gain seats, but they've managed, and it's been, I think, a very effective strategy at putting some sandbags up against what otherwise might be a wave against some of their more vulnerable new incumbents and others. At the same time, in North Carolina and other places, what they've managed to do is to really hit at the remaining small number of blue dog Democrats. So if you look at shoring up those districts, and in some cases it means that some of the new members are actually going to be hit from the right, those who've voted for anything in Washington. You're probably going to see, as a result of all of this, a Republican Party that moves in the House even a bit further to the right, and a Democratic Party that moves further to the left. So the polarization that we've seen is only going to get exacerbated in the 113th Congress.
Other questions in the back? Here. The mic, Brent, right there.
Joe Freeman, I'm a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Could you comment on the political implications of the bill linking the extension of the payroll tax reduction and the XL pipeline? I thought Obama dodged a bullet when he pushed that into 2013. Are the Republicans trying to bring it back, or do you think they made some sort of a deal?
I don't know. I think he dodged a bullet the way the British dodged a bullet at the Battle of the Somme. The Keystone Pipeline was an attempt by the president voting present and saying he won't decide until 2013 was an attempt to propitiate environmental left fringe. And for a president who says he wants to create jobs, it's an absolutely inexplicable decision. And it polls very badly, so the Republicans have seized on it as an easy way for them to say this administration's environmental regulations and regime is killing jobs. I don't know how it's going to turn out in policy. I suspect the House Republicans will not succeed in getting that into law, but I think politically it's a big plus for them every time the Keystone Pipeline comes up. We actually, know how to build oil pipelines in this country and keep them out of aquifers. The best indicator of a incumbent president not being able to succeed in winning a second term is if you face a debilitating challenge from your own party's base. And Barack Obama has avoided that. It's actually kind of striking because there's a lot of unhappiness on the left, and that's been particularly true in the environmental area. So the decision that he made was a fairly predictable one. I think the Republican inclusion of the pipeline in this case is not because of the pipeline. It's because John Boehner wanted to get the overwhelming majority of his own Republicans supporting an extension of the payroll tax cut. And he simply could not do it without finding something else. That something else was the pipeline. And the pipeline is there not just because they think it would poll pretty well,
but also because they want something that they think will really stick it to the president, and you could see that in some of the comments that they made. And it worked for him. His alternative was to push through an extension of the payroll tax cut by losing half his Republicans and picking up the rest among Democrats. And he has assiduously avoided any of those outcomes because it undermines his own support he's got headaches from his own leadership. So that's worked to this point. It's not going to succeed in terms of getting the legislation through. And if it did, it would be a Pyrrhic victory, because the way the bill is written, it requires a decision within 60 days whether this is in the nation's interest, and it requires a review that the agencies have said they can't complete. And so you could actually kill the pipeline instead of just pushing the date off to 2013. So it's there for other reasons, but I don't think it's going to work.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. We have a question back here, and then I'm going to take this one. You go first, and then we'll have your question, and then we'll let the panel answer.
Hi, Josh Burek, AEI. One explanation for the frequency of lead changes among the GOP field is that voters simply aren't happy with what amounts to a B list after Haley Barbour, Mitch Daniels, and Chris Christie decided not to run. Do you buy that view? And if so, is there another election year in recent memory where so much talent sat on the sidelines?
And let's get this question over here.
Norm, you made a comment about not discounting the probability of somebody else entering the race in February and March. I was wondering if the panel had some names in mind as far as who that might be.
Okay.
To answer Josh's question, on the talent part, we shouldn't forget that in 1988, the Democratic field was derisively referred to as the Seven Dwarves. And people looked at the 1992 field for the Democrats and thought that that was incredibly weak, as well as most of the party's major figures thought that George Herbert Walker Bush, after the first Gulf War victory, was politically unassailable. So I think the reason why we've had a lot of lead changes is because the secret to winning a Republican primary is to take the loyalty of one of the two parties' wings and marry it with an element of maturity, stability, and experience. Traditionally, the conservative candidate, there's either been not one conservative candidate, as Karlyn pointed out, or the conservative favorite has been somebody without much experience, without much gravitas, and that scared the center of the Republican voting bloc, the somewhat conservative voter, away. And in fact, if you look at the lead changes, virtually every candidate that's jumped to the top when under close scrutiny has failed to demonstrate that sort of gravitas, seriousness, and maturity, which is why Gingrich is somebody who has more staying power than Kaine or Bachmann, because part of his rise is precisely because he's demonstrated in the debates a seriousness, a gravitas, and maturity and intelligence, combined with his experience, that traditionally is what the center of the Republican electorate is looking for. He not only runs best among Tea Party voters, but he runs very well among the somewhat conservative voters, and he's basically running tied or only slightly behind among moderate voters. His greatest strength right now, oddly enough, is his temperament, because what the voters see in debates is not what people in Washington have seen for the last 30 years. His greatest weakness is his pattern. If he reverts to form, he'll drive the very voters who find him attractive because of his temperament away, and then you'll see the lead change happen again.
Norm.
I'll tell you, it's been interesting that these focus groups have at times asked, if these candidates were a relative, what relative would they be? And Mitt Romney is the second cousin who comes to stay and stays too long. And Gingrich is avuncular. He's the jolly grandfather uncle figure. How long that lasts, especially if you talk to his colleagues who were there with him through those years in the 90s, that's not quite how they see him. Let's put it that way. In terms of who comes in, there's going to be, I think, a lot of pressure. If these two guys look weaker and weaker on those A-list candidates again, you're going to see a lot of people going back to Mitch Daniels and back to Chris Christie, and if they can't get those guys, and to Haley Barbour, if they can't get them, then they may turn to a highly visible congressional figure in some way or another. They may turn to a placeholder who at least can win enough delegates to send it to the convention, and then try and get the candidate they all want, which is Jeb Bush, to step forward, moving in on the white horse to win a nomination. You have to still say the odds of these things happening are considerably less than 50%, much as we might all want it just for the drama of it. But I could easily see delegations going back and begging one of these other candidates to please save us from the possibility that we could take this incredible opportunity and snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
And on that note, we hope. Oh, sorry, Mike.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess I disagree a little with Norm on this. I agree that it's theoretically possible for us to get a Valentine's Day surprise, or from the point of view of the existing candidates, the Valentine's Day massacre, of a new candidate entering.